Chasing the Mind Podcast, Episode 5, Talk Back. Welcome to Chasing the Mind, hosted by Dr. Angela Johnson and Dr. Stephanie Schwartz, the podcast that explores psychology as both art and science. Every week, Dr. Angela and Dr. Stephanie will feature a topic or guest who offers a unique perspective in answering the following questions. How do our thoughts influence our sense of who we are? How do we impact the world around us? And can changing our minds change everything? Today on Chasing the Mind, Dr. Angela and Dr. Stephanie will be answering questions from listeners and discussing their thoughts on the first 4 episodes. Our first question's from a listener. Psychopaths, is that in the brain?
Dr. Angela, I believe this is up your alley.
Yes, and I've been warned by Dr. Stephanie not to talk about this for the next 45 minutes to an hour, which I could easily do. Because we're going to probably do a podcast about psychopaths at some point. But basically the issue of whether or not psychopathy can be seen in structural differences in the brains of psychopaths is pretty well established science. There have been a number of studies that have looked at brain scans at the frontal lobes of the brain where judgment and decision-making are made. They're different in psychopaths versus normal people, as well as other structures in the brain that have to do with regulating emotion, fear, anger. So definitely there are some differences. I think the bigger question is, just because you have those differences in your brain, what does that really mean? Because obviously not everyone who has some of these variations in their brain structures turn out to be psychopaths. And I think that might be the bigger conversation that would be interesting to have at some point on a later episode of Chasing the Mind.
So question number 2, to what extent can intelligence be measured? How do you define intelligence? And are there abilities that fall outside of what IQ tests can measure?
Aha, Dr. Stephanie.
Yes, actually, testing and particularly intelligence testing is one of my areas that I'm really interested in. Dr. Angela has warned me, however, not to go over 45 minutes with this answer. So there's a lot of debate on what is intelligence and how is it measured. First of all, there are many different IQ tests out there, although there are a couple that have become the most standard ones. And there's a lot of debate about whether IQ as a singular number and intelligence as a singular concept can help us understand someone. And people have a lot of resistance to that idea. And some people even deny that there is such a thing as intelligence. And I think there's a lot of room for debate and discussion about the fine points. I would say, having worked in special needs classrooms with cognitively impaired students, if you try to completely do away with the idea that there is something there in the concept of intelligence, then you are missing perhaps an important aspect of human functioning. So I'm hoping that we're going to do an entire episode on this.
Well, actually, I think multiple episodes could be done on intelligence. I mean, even for the first question that we talked about, psychopathy, I mean, there's an idea in the public culture that psychopaths are very intelligent, which is not always true, in the ways that intelligence plays a role in forensic decisions is also a topic that's really relevant and very important. For example, the Supreme Court deciding that you couldn't execute someone who had an IQ of below 70.
The fact that people with under average intelligence are overrepresented in the criminal justice system.
Exactly.
Another place where your expertise in forensics and my interest in testing and assessment overlap.
Okay, well, a lot of listeners, there's been a lot of questions. Actually, probably the most common question was, what was the thumping in episode 1?
Well, we've actually talked about the fact that these are sort of casual conversations between me and Dr. Angela. And one person you may not know who is here is Berkeley, the dog. And originally, Berkeley was thought to that he would be about 35 to 40 pounds when he came as a puppy. Now, as a beautiful, full-grown Labradoodle of 104 pounds, when he's excited and happy, his tail makes quite a sound. And that is what you will hear definitely in episode 1, possibly on subsequent occasions. So, yeah. He's a beautiful dog, and he's not big for a pony.
Now that you've finished 4 podcast episodes, do you have any thoughts from the first 4?
Well, so going back to podcast 0 before we move on to the episodes, I realized when I listened through it that I sounded more like I was the parent or the mother of chickens and a dog than my actual children. So I thought I should correct that point. I am a mother of 2 beautiful boys, Graham, age 5, almost 6, and Daniel, who just turned 1. And I am the mother to 100-and-something pound Labradoodle and 6 chickens who are now laying eggs. So I'm very excited about that.
And I just had some of those eggs for dinner. That was very exciting. I am the mother to 2 beautiful cats. They were adopted from a shelter. So let's have a shout out to shelters everywhere and pet adoption.
So our first episode, Trey, who talked about LARPing.
That was a lot of fun, particularly because it allowed us to talk about storytelling and talk about nerd activities, some of the things that we're interested in. But one of the things that both of us found really interesting was Trey's statement that she realized that one of her LARP characters had claustrophobia, and she stated that she had never had any feelings of claustrophobia, any issues with that problem, but yet this particular character that she plays does have that problem. So what were your thoughts on that, Dr. Angela?
Well, I think we talked about at the time, that sometimes it's in any kind of creative process, when you embody a character, whether you're writing about it, whether you're acting, whatever you're doing, that sometimes the characters do things that they do and you don't really necessarily plan for them or anticipate. I thought about that a little bit because you talked about the physiological responses that she had. This wasn't just like she had a thought that her character was claustrophobic. She actually experienced the changes in her body that went along with feeling claustrophobic. I mean, I think it's fascinating. I think it's really interesting that you can sort of embody a character to that degree that something would happen that would be, really outside of your own experience.
One of the things it reminded me of was when I was first learning about dream interpretation from traditional psychotherapists. One of the things that was told to me was, in a dream, you play all the roles. And so it makes me wonder if there isn't some part of Trey, and only she would be able to answer this, that either has some claustrophobia to express or that knows someone who represents that part of her. It just really made me think. Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about podcast 2. I think you found that very moving as well.
I have had a lot of the same kinds of journeys and experiences around issues of, what is the meaning of life and why are we here? And is there anything else after that? And, I've sort of been traveling that road since I think I was about 12. For me, what resonates when talking about this subject, especially listening to Dr. Wellen Levine talk, is how important it is to her, how much it's taken up the space of her mind and thinking about it. And for me, I've had similar times in my life when that's been true. And I think especially after I had my first son, Graham, and there was a period when he was about 6 or 7 months old that I became really, really anxious around issues of being an older mom, And I began to have anxiety and really some obsessions. I wasn't going to live long enough to see him grow up, and I wasn't going to, I was going to leave my poor little baby, who's going to be motherless. And it just became this really an obsessive kind of debilitating anxiety that I would have. And especially at night when I would put him down, it was so hard. And I'd always put him down every night. But I went through this period where I had to kind of have Kevin do it because it was so upsetting to me. And I actually ended up talking to a therapist about it. And she actually told me that this is not an uncommon thing for mothers, those who give birth, those who are mothers by adoption, which is my case. But that any fears that we have when you have kids can become even more intense. And especially when it comes to things like, your ability to be there for your kids. And so, that was really helpful for me. And I began to do some things to help cope with those feelings. And I'll say when I had Daniel, I didn't experience that kind of intense anxiety that I did with Graham because I'd worked through some of that and found some ways of managing it. But, and I've met other moms since then who've had the same kinds of feelings. I think it's important to talk about.
It's interesting because it's one of those things about being a parent that perhaps is not as much talked about.
Yeah. Wonder Woman. That was podcast 3, Wonder Woman.
Well, I thought that discussion about Wonder Woman was really stimulating and a great jumping off point. I don't know about you. For me, Wonder Woman, the success of the movie, the interest in the character, really brings out a lot of ideas about feminism, about, first of all, what it took to get the Wonder Woman movie made in comparison to some of the other movies. I mean, we've had how many really bad iterations of the Hulk origin story?
Well, how many times have we done Batman? I mean,
right.
How many times do you have to see those parents getting mugged outside of the movie theater? Honest to God.
It's very sad, but you don't need that
many.
It is
sad.
Yeah.
And the thing is, too, I mean, especially, we talk about the success of the movie, but if it had been anything less than a blockbuster commercial powerhouse titan of money raining down from the sky, that you would have never heard about Wonder Woman ever again. Whereas, like you said, Hulk bombs, make another one. Hulk bombs, make another one. Batman, we can do it again, make another one. Batman versus Superman totally sucked, apparently. Didn't see it. But, we'll keep going with the franchise. I mean, that is also part of the story where it's like that, not only do female characters not get represented, but then if they get represented, unless they do phenomenally well, it's like, that doesn't work. Women characters won't work.
I think there's a whole podcast in there.
Podcast 4. Bartender Without the Booze. Taylor.
Right. Well, I talked a bit about sort of emotional work because we talk about work. Psychologists research different aspects of work. One that has been less talked about is emotional work. People in service industries have to smile, have to be pleasant, even in the face of customers who are unpleasant. A lot of the people who do that kind of emotional work are paid very little. Service industries pay very little. And also then there's other fields.
There's a lot of professions for which that's true. I think you could talk to teachers who know a lot about their students and the families. You could talk to medical professionals, nurses, nursing, people who work in skilled nursing facilities. And those are people who are doing really hard work and not just, work where they have to have all this training, but they're doing this work where they have to be on all the time.
Yeah, as you know, I'm a university professor, and that's a big aspect of the work in teaching. Now, I teach 50 minutes to 3 hours at a time for one class. Sometimes my classes are back to back. And that emotional aspect of having to be on in terms of similar to a performance, is a big aspect of what I do. If I just sit there and drone on about psychology, which some of my students might say that's what I do, but actually I put a lot of energy into trying to be entertaining and transmitting the material in as engaging and memorable a way as possible. It's a big part of that work, and I imagine it's even more so for elementary and high school teachers, because they literally have to be on hour after hour after hour, day after day. And people, I think, in other kinds of, like, perhaps office jobs might not understand that.
Well, that leads us into another listener question. How do you take care of yourself mentally and emotionally when you work at a giving and or distressing job?
Personally, I'm a big advocate for meditation. When I was talking earlier about dealing with my own issues around anxiety and some obsessions, that's really what I did. I began a meditative practice. And even though it felt like, what am I doing sitting on a cushion for 10 minutes or 20 minutes a day, I really found that the benefits of engaging in that place of quietness and being present and learning to let go and accept and be and all the things that you do when you meditate really helped me. And it helped me when I was chasing my kid, and it helped me when I was going to court, and it helped me in all sorts of situations. So I think finding some kind of practice, if it's not meditation, something else, walk in the woods. Some people find cooking meditative. Some people find, coloring became a big thing a couple of years ago because, again, it's just a place to focus your attention in a way that is fully present. You're not off thinking about the 500 things you have to do at your job. You're just being. And I think that's a key.
I've definitely used artistic expression. You talked about coloring. In the past, I've been involved in a pottery class, and pottery is actually a great choice for dealing with work problems because, for me at least, and probably for a lot of people, pottery is hard. You have to focus on the exact angle of your hands, the balance between your arms and the rest of your body, the shape you're trying to make, the wetness level of the clay. I mean, there's a lot of things to concentrate on. And it's not exactly not stressful, but it really does crowd out everything else in your mind.
Another strategy, obviously having people who are supportive in your life is helpful to provide, mental and emotional support. But I can't say enough about having a therapist if you need a therapist. And this is one of those things I think sometimes that people resist because they feel like I don't have the time, or what am I going to talk about? Or
if I have a therapist, it means I'm crazy.
Right. All the stigma involved with it. But the reality is that for most people in this society, with the stressors that we all deal with to varying degrees, most of us at some point in our lives would benefit from having a person outside of our home, our work, our religious orientation, whatever, who's just there to listen to us, who's just there to create a safe space for us to go through whatever we have to go through, either to talk about something, to just feel something, to strategize, to come up with solutions, but also just to be heard. There's a really powerful thing that happens in therapy, and there's a bearing witness that really takes place. And that's a lot of what therapy is. And I think to say, I need this, I need to go find someone at this point in my life where I can just have someone bear witness to the crap I have to put up with at work. Do it. Find a therapist. It's very challenging if you don't have insurance. So sometimes there are ways to meet with someone, a counselor of some kind, even if you don't have health insurance. Some clinics take sliding scale. But I would really encourage people who are struggling to look into the option of getting a professional therapist to help them if they need it.
Absolutely. And I think I just want to say one more quick thing in terms of working at a distressing job. Boundaries are really, really important. And I think that's one area where people often struggle. the boundaries between one's working life and non-working life. For many kinds of jobs, that's become very porous because there's so many technologically wonderful ways that have helped our workplace be in touch with us at any hour of the day or night. And I think that it's important to find boundaries between your personal life and your work life, both literally in terms of defining times when you will and won't be available, and also emotionally. There have been jobs that I had earlier on that I probably should have set more of a boundary. And you have to learn sometimes, especially in a caring profession, that it's important to care for the people you are caring for, but you can't let it take over. And you need to at some point say, I care, but I need to let certain things go. And I think that's a thing that some people struggle with. Many people struggle with, especially people who go into helping professions, because they went into them to help.
Right.
But sometimes you need to sort of put on your own oxygen mask first and say, I'm taking care of me first, and I'm taking care of my family. And the helping work, that piece of emotional work that I'm doing in the workplace, that needs to take second or third or fourth place. And some people think that that's being hardened, but I think it's being realistic, because if you try without having boundaries to just let all those emotions rush in all the time, you're going to burn out. And that's not helpful for anyone. It's not helpful for you, and it's not helpful for your future clients.
And I think that's a whole topic.
That is a whole topic.
For a podcast is on burnout, especially in the helping professions. And of course, you can't say enough about we're meant to be on a schedule, go to bed at the same time, get up at the same time, eat at regular intervals, try to eat healthy, at least 80% of the time, try to get some kind of air and or exercise a little bit every day. We get into patterns. That aren't always healthy for us. And it's really hard to break a pattern. And I mean, there's a million books out there on self-help about how to be happy and how to be whole and healthy and wise and eat clean. And if we actually did it, there'd be like one book, like we'd all pass it around and then we'd all be done. Right. But, there's a reason. And I think some of those are systemic. The society that we live in, and some of them are just, that's kind of how people are. We kind of keep going until we can't anymore. I mean, that's a lot of it, right? I didn't get to meditating until like I had to. I asked my husband, actually, I've been really interested in meditation and Eastern philosophy and Buddhism and all that for years. And I finally decided I'm going to start a meditation practice. And I asked my husband for a meditation cushion, which he dutifully bought me for Christmas. And
he's a really nice husband.
And it sat in the corner for I think at least a year, maybe a year and a half, until finally, it was so bad. My anxiety was so bad and everything was so bad that I was like, all right, I'll try anything at this point. I will try anything. And so that's sometimes how we are, unfortunately. We're like, until we have to, we don't.
And if you really need a creative outlet, a different thing to think about, and you're really stuck for an idea, why not start a podcast?
Yeah, exactly. Start a podcast. Make your husband buy you an entire podcasting studio for your birthday.
Again, a nice husband. All right.
Wow, let's change the subject here a little bit and go to that of current events. We get a lot of questions from listeners involving current political events, including diagnosing political figures.
Yeah, so this is so interesting. It's been in the news a lot. The American Psychiatric Association basically came up with the Goldwater Rule. And this was about Barry Goldwater when he ran for office. Basically, there were a bunch of medical professional psychiatrists running around diagnosing him. And so...
Well, actually, they sent out a survey of psychiatrists.
My smart husband.
And the survey was returned by a very small number of psychiatrists. Most of the psychiatrists just threw it in the garbage. And that small number, even smaller number of them diagnosed, Mr. Goldwater with, I actually don't recall what the diagnosis was, but it didn't matter at that point, because then they took, 1,000 psychiatrists say,
oh, right.
When it was in fact, a very small percentage of the psychiatrists actually said that.
So anyway, so the profession decided that it is unethical for psychiatrists to diagnose individuals that are not their clients that they have not ever met just based on their public persona. The American Psychological Association, which oversees psychologists, adopted the same basic rule, which is that you should not diagnose people that you have no information about other than viewing them in the public light. That being said, beyond any particular political figure, it's generally not a good idea to make opinions about things you don't know very much about, especially when it comes to issues of mental health. I certainly have my opinions about political people, informed or not, based on being a psychologist or not. But, to start espousing that someone in particular has a mental illness or a personality disorder in a public forum, all it does is stigmatize the idea of anyone who presents with, a mental illness or characterological symptoms of a personality disorder. It's not helpful, in other words. It doesn't help enrich the conversation, and it certainly doesn't help anyone who is struggling with some of these issues.
And I think it also minimizes the expertise of psychologists and psychiatrists. I think psychology in particular is a field that people tend to assume because they have a personality or they have a psychology, they are somehow an expert in said psychology. And when people see a psychologist or psychiatrist diagnosing someone about whom they know very little, whom they've never met, I think it does minimize and detract from the value of actual psychological assessment.
I think it is reasonable for people who are trained in psychology to speak to characteristics that are concerning and speak to the reasons why they might be concerning. It's certainly reasonable to say that some of those traits raise questions about certain issues, but to outright diagnose someone, I just think it diminishes your credibility as an expert. It reduces mental illness to sort of a throwaway. My spice rack is organized. I have OCD. The ways that we sort of minimize and incorporate these throwaway taglines about mental illness. And that's really not what mental illness is. It's not that you organize your spice rack. So we need to be careful as professionals that we don't muddy the waters any more than is already done by the culture at large.
Given that, what are some self-care strategies for dealing with the current political environment and without, say, withdrawing from society as a solution?
Well, I don't think withdrawing from society is a good idea. I do think limiting media exposure at this point is a good thing. With the 24-hour news cycle and the 24-hour outrage cycle, I think that it's important to be informed about current events. But the degree to which a lot of us are glued to our smartphones and just get lost in this well of difficult current events and difficult current events from around the globe, it's just overwhelming and unhelpful. I think if there's something you are passionate about, then do something to work towards that issue. Climate issues are very upsetting to me. Issues of economic inequality are very upsetting to me. So I do certain things in my personal life to work on those issues. But if I just spend hour after hour watching pictures of stranded polar bears and whales that are dying because of the amount of plastic that's in them and poverty, if I do that hour after hour after hour, that is very unhelpful to my mental health, and it's not going to help the issue get any better either. So I think limiting media time, and particularly news media time, actually, at the the way things are going is not a bad strategy.
And I think, what you said about trying to find a way to do something is really important, even if it's really unrelated. I think for me, and I have at times been more of a political junkie than I am now. I tend to be more like, I don't want to see the news at all, ever. Obviously, some things still break through, really important events like what happened in Charlottesville last week, that breaks through like that I have to pay attention to, and I have to make a decision about what am I going to do in response to that.
Dr. Angela, I know we both do a lot of things that we believe passionately, and I just finished putting together a bunch of backpacks for school-age children who live in poverty. And it's something I do every year because there's an achievement gap in terms of socioeconomic status. So poor kids don't achieve as well as rich kids do. And there's something I can do about it. It's a positive thing that I can contribute, so I do it. So what kinds of things do you do to make a positive force on the world?
I think it's challenging to find ways to feel like you make a difference. Things do feel overwhelming, like you mentioned, climate change. It's like, what can one person do? So I think you do have to find the one way that you can make a difference. So for us, it's maybe having a garden. For us, we have chickens. We're like doing the urban farmer thing. I belong to a church that does some social justice work. When there are things in our neighborhood where we can go and stand for a particular viewpoint that we find, that we want to promote. I have my kids go out with me and we do that together as a family.
I remember that you and your family went to the Women's March and found that very...
We did. We went to the Women's March. The kids were great, actually. They did a great job. Again, there's going to be similar kinds of resistant marches soon because of the things that have happened as a result of Charlottesville and some of those groups and the counter protest to that. It's one of those things. You obviously, most people can't go out and protest every day. It's not possible. But I think there are small ways that you find to impact even the small world that you live in, even just being aware of the ways in which maybe your voice drowns out other voices and trying to promote other voices. I think you just have to do the best that you can. I think there's no other way around it at this point. You just have to do the best you can.
And I think all of the things we talked about for self-care, if you are in a job that is difficult, where you have to, do a lot of emotional work, I think those things are equally applicable for coping with difficult news and things going on in our general society.
Yeah. And, it's funny because on one hand, it's like you can bear the brunt and sit under the weight of I'm one person, what can I do? But on the other hand, you're only one person. You can kind of let some of it go too. The whole world isn't resting on you. So I think it's that whole idea of you have to let go and let be. You have to find a place of acceptance and this doesn't mean you don't work to change things. It doesn't mean you don't actively pursue the goals that you think are important. But at some point you have to not clutch those things so desperately because ultimately you really don't have that much control over those things. So I'm going to go back to find a place to meditate where you can just let things go. There's a meditation on loving kindness where you sit and you concentrate on yourself and may you be well. May you be filled with loving kindness. May you be happy. And then you extend that out to the people that you love and you care about. May they be well. May they be happy. May they be filled with loving kindness. And you extend that out further and further. And there is something kind of transformative about thinking about your worst enemy and wishing them well and wishing them loving kindness and the entire world. And I think maybe it does change something, maybe in the next interaction you have, maybe in the next thing that comes to your mind to do that's going to make a difference in someone's life. Maybe going back to Stephanie Wellen-Levine and there's this universal consciousness that we somehow impact. I don't know. But I think just being able to sit and want goodness for yourself, health for yourself, wellness for yourself, and everyone else in the world, if we all did that, I think that might make some difference in the world.
That's lovely.
We here at Chasing the Mind love receiving listener questions, so keep them coming. We will answer them in a future Talkback episode coming up. We also appreciate suggestions for shows. You can email us at info@chasingthemind.com. Visit our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter at Chasing the Mind, and subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher. We are going to be fine-tuning our web presence and pod hosting, so we will keep you up to date on that. Thank you for listening to Chasing the Mind. Today's episode featured music from purpleplanet.com. Please visit our website at chasingthemind.com and please subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher.